Hello, Kirk Small Group family. Thank you so much for another great week of small groups, and we look forward to another week of small groups. So, for this Sunday sermon passage, we have Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. Our sermon text is part of the bigger story that starts with Luke 14, verse 1, where Jesus goes over to a house of a Pharisee to eat with the Pharisees. They were watching him. The word here, watch, is in Greek is to more of to observe, like a hawk, to see if Jesus does anything wrong, to find fault with him. And so you can definitely feel the tension in the air. In verse 2, it talks about a man with dropsy. Now, there is no way a man with dropsy, a disease where there is tremendous water retention in the body, and the person is incredibly bloated, could have been in a Pharisee's house standing in front of Jesus, because he would have been considered unclean and Pharisees would not have had anything to do with him. You know that this is a setup to see what Jesus will do on a Sabbath. Will Jesus heal him or will he not on a Sabbath? And they want to catch him at his work so that they can say, aha, well, you know what? Jesus heals him, of course, and turns to the Pharisees to ask, if one of you is a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day? They don't respond. And that's the point Jesus is making. It's as if Jesus is saying that man with dropsy, you only see him as a means to an end. You don't see any worth in him. Well, I do. He's a beloved child of God, and unless you change the way you see the world and how you live in this society, unless you can see the inherent value in people and not the value the society places on them, you'll never be able to enter into the kingdom of God. And the parable Jesus tells after this is about the banquet and the place of honor. That is really all about how God sees us. Gospel of Luke is forever concerned with who's in and who's out. And of course, those who are in Luke's society are those who are out in God's kingdom, and vice versa. So at this point, let me go into the first digging in question. It asks for your definition of humility, because obviously those who are in God's kingdom are those who are humble. It asks you to look at John chapter 13, verses 3 through 5, where it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe and tied a towel around himself. And guess what he started doing? He began to wash the feet of his disciples. I love this passage. How can Jesus be so humble? For me, the answer lies in knowing where he came from and knowing where he is going part. For me, humility really comes from knowing who you are. It doesn't come from low self-esteem, but just the opposite. It comes from the confidence that you have in knowing who you are and whose you are. Same thing in Matthew chapter 20:28. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. It has such sense of purpose there, doesn't it? The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Examine your own lives. Where does your sense of humility come from? I hope it comes from knowing who you are in the eyes of God. Second question in the digging in part deals with the transactional faith, quid pro quo. Read Caroline Lewis quote carefully for this one. The parable Jesus tells in this passage is a really radical story for those who are living in honor-shame culture. Their livelihood, Lucan audience's livelihood, depended on how much honor they gained and what they were willing to do for it. Their society was so heavily based on, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, that they could not imagine not doing that, because that's what they grew up with and that's what has been ingrained in their minds. What about us? Where do we find worth in people these days? What are we expected to do so that people will find us worthy in our church and in our society alike? We're a society that's obsessed with productivity. What about our church? Are we any different? How can we be a church that moves people from a place of lowliness and disdain to honor and dignity? How can we be a church that uses people? How can we not be a church that uses people with dropsy to prove ourselves righteous? What if we all saw each other like God sees us rather than how the world sees us? Would it be different? Now, the third question is about the overall idea that the Bible is riddled with paradoxes, just like we see in Luke chapter 14, verse 11, where it says, if you want to be exalted, humble yourself. If you want to live, die. If you want to be great, learn to be a servant. What do these paradoxes say about God's kingdom? I think the presence of paradoxes in the Bible is a lesson for us that unless there is a shift in our paradigm of how we see the world, unless we can become countercultural, we'll never embrace the kingdom of God. Unless we change the way we think and see the world and others, we'll never even begin to understand what God is all about. What beliefs do you have to let go of today to embrace God's countercultural and radical kingdom? I hope you get to talk about that as well in your small groups. I hope you really go into going out questions about revising your guest list, and ways to restore dignity and honor to those who have been pushed down to the lowliest of places. And I hope you'll have the chance to read one of my favorite Donahue blessings as well, about seeing yourself and others the way God sees you. So I imagine this story ending something like this. Jesus leaves the Pharisee's house and sees the man with dropsy that he had just healed. And I see Jesus and the healed dropsy man sit down together staring into the night sky. Maybe Jesus has a beer in one hand and hands another beer to the man with dropsy. Oh, I don't know. This is just my imagination. And Jesus says to the guy, now that you're all healed, what do you dream about? What do you dream for your future? And maybe the dropsy man says, I dream about getting a job and maybe even a wife. And he turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, what do you dream about? And I imagine Jesus saying, I dream about a world where one day a man with the dropsy will be given the highest place of honor at the banquet. I dream about a world that's so full of love that a man with dropsy will be seen for the child of God that he is, rather than a tool for others to prove themselves right. And I dream about the same world, and I hope you do as well. What about you, friends? What do you dream about? I hope you get to talk about your dreams and your hopes for this world and how our church can come together to bring about a world that we can dream about. Have a great small group. Such an honor to be serving with each and every one of you. Peace out.